These are the new DJI Goggles N3. This is DJI's first budget FPV goggle designed to be used with the Neo and the Avata 2 drones. We believe these goggles will also be compatible in the future with the new upcoming O4 air unit, and what makes these particularly interesting is the fact that they cost just $230. Now, in this video, I'm going to give you an overview of these goggles. I'm going to walk you through their features and specifications, and then at the very end, I'm going to share with you my thoughts. Now, I was not sent these goggles from DJI. I have not been sponsored by DJI, but this video was sponsored by Grey Arrows Drone Club. Grey Arrows Drone Club is not only a discussion group where you can go on and find information about DJI drones, FPV, and all things related to flying, they are also the team behind Drone Scene. Drone Scene is a website where you can go and put in where you live, and it will actually give you ideas of places that you can fly in the UK. Alongside the Drone Scene website, they also offer their insurance. You can get cover for up to £5 million of public liability for hobby use, and this is incredibly useful because whilst we all fly, anything bad could happen at any time, and having insurance means if there was ever an issue, you're going to be covered. If the worst was to happen, such as it falling from the sky, hitting a car, hitting property, you're going to be covered. Membership is available for as little as £16 a year, and for just £25 a year, you have access to that full £5 million of insurance cover, discount on store purchases, no adverts on the website, and access to enter the competition prize draws. If you're interested in finding out more about Grey Arrows Drone Club as well as Drone Scene and their membership, please do check out the links in the description. Now, the new DJI Goggles N3 are their latest FPV goggle, and they should be classed as a budget goggle designed to be used with drones such as the DJI Neo and the DJI Avata 2. Now, at the point of me recording this video, these goggles only work with the Neo or the Avata 2. They are not compatible with the Avata 1, the FPV Drone, any of DJI's other camera drones, and they are also not compatible with the DJI O3 air unit. We do believe, and this isn't confirmed as absolute fact, but we have been told that these goggles will also work with the upcoming DJI O4 air unit. However, that is not available at the point of me recording this video, and as a result of that, they will only work with these two drones. There is no information if these goggles will ever be compatible with the likes of the DJI O3 air unit or earlier. As I've said, it is just these two right now, and we believe to be O4 when that releases in the new year. Now, walking you over the spec of these goggles, they feature a single 1080p display. These should be deemed as a box goggle because they work similar to other box goggles that we've seen from manufacturers. There is a single display on the top here, and then there's mirrors inside that reflect that out to the two lenses here. What's different on these goggles compared to most box goggles is that they usually have a single lens that goes across the front, whereas these have two individual lenses, but they do both merge to see the single display. As for that display, it is a 1080p display rated at 60 Hz, and that means the maximum refresh rate you will get from these goggles will be 60 frames a second, although whilst the goggles can't display any more than 60 frames a second, they are compatible with the 100 frames a second modes on the likes of the DJI Avata 2. It's just that the display image will only be 60 frames a second. Now, as a result of these lenses, you get a 54-degree field of view on that display. So whilst it isn't quite as big as we've seen on the likes of E2, it is bigger than we've had on some of the OLED goggles. As a result of these lenses being fixed, unfortunately, there is no IPD or focus adjustment on these goggles. There's no knobs, there's no controls, there's no options for installing diopters either. The only thing you're going to be able to do with these goggles is wear glasses. There is plenty of space in the face mask area if you do wear glasses, but unfortunately there are no adjustments with regards to how the image is for your eyes. Now, like the Goggles 3, the N3 is based off the new DJI O4 FPV system. These goggles only have 4 antennas compared to the 6 antennas in the Goggles 3. We have 2 non-removable external antennas here, and then there are 2 antennas mounted internally. We're not exactly sure where they are. We'll be taking a look at that when I tear these goggles down. They do, though, support all of the new modes available in O4 up to 60 megabits a second, and we do believe that they will also support the new upcoming race mode that's going to be available on the O4 system as well. Now, just walking you around them externally, on the top you can see in the middle here we have our micro SD card slot. These goggles do have a built-in DVR like all of the other goggles from DJI, and just like on the Goggles 2, the Integra and Goggles 3, you have the option of recording a clean view image onto the SD card or the image with your OSD as well. There is also our USB port on the top there for charging as well as updating the firmware. These goggles do feature a built-in battery pack. You can see that on the rear there. Again, very similar to the Goggles Integra and Goggles 3, and that is charged via that port there. Also on the top, we then have our 5-way joystick as well as our back button. These goggles do not have a touchpad. All of the controls are done via these buttons here, like we saw on the Goggles 3. The power cable for the battery is external on these goggles compared to what we saw on the Goggles 3 and Integra. It runs under here, but it is a fixed power cable. It is not removable. You can't unplug this to allow you to swap it out, unfortunately. Looking around the rest, you can see underneath that there are some vents down here, and then finally on this side over here we have our power button for turning them on. Now, as I mentioned, these goggles do have the built-in battery like we've seen from DJI before. This is fully integrated. This will give you about 2.5 hours of runtime, and that is charged via that USB-C port on the front there, as I mentioned earlier. This is fixed on a strap that goes through the back. It has the adjustments here for tightening and loosening the strap, and that then comes over and is mounted onto the goggles in 2 places on either side. I'm going to class this as non-removable at this point because I haven't found a way to easily get it off, but obviously there will be a way to remove it if you absolutely have to. Now, with regards to the face mask, this is removable. It's made of 2 different materials. You have this really large soft foam that goes around there, and then we have the rubber flaps down there around your nose area. Now, this is removable. It will unclip from the goggles, just like we've seen from DJI in the past. At the point of me making this video, there aren't any alternatives that I've seen available, but I'm sure that we will see alternatives from other manufacturers as time goes on. Now, something else to mention about these goggles that I haven't seen mentioned anywhere else is the fact that these goggles do not have GPS built in. When DJI released the Goggles Integra, they introduced GPS to allow you to use those goggles with the likes of the Avata 2, the Avata, in areas that have remote ID without having to connect your smartphone. DJI included that GPS functionality in the Goggles 3. However, having now torn these goggles down, I can confirm that there is no GPS included in the Goggles N3 as it is here. What's quite interesting is when you look at the internals, DJI do actually have a place on the PCB for the GPS antenna as well as the connections and the circuitry. However, it isn't populated in my goggles. I've spent some time looking through DJI specification. There is no mention of GPS whatsoever. Right now, the goggles I see here and all of the goggles I believe DJI are going to ship are not going to have GPS. Whether they make a version specifically for the bigger drones in the future with GPS remains to be seen. The fact, though, that the board does have that area unpopulated is particularly interesting. What that means is if you did want to use these in a remote ID area, whilst DJI haven't said it in their instructions, I'm going to assume that it's going to work exactly the same as the goggles Goggles 2 or the V2s, where you're going to need to plug in your Fly app to the goggles to be able to take off. Now, DJI have most likely done this because these goggles are only actually available with the Neo at this moment in time. They really are designed to be used with the Neo, and whilst they do have compatibility for the Avata 2, it's not its main use case. And again, it's just something that DJI have been able to reduce on cost to be able to make them cheaper. Now, these goggles are quite a bit bigger and heavier than the other goggles that we've seen from DJI in recent times. They are more like the design of the V2s, but they are actually quite a bit bigger than them as well, and we'll compare them in a moment. With regards to weight, DJI has these at 536 grams with the included battery, and they say it's 349 grams on its own for the main headset itself. When you compare them to the likes of the V2 goggles, if I just grab them, you can see, putting them on the deck, they are quite a bit bigger in some ways. If I just pop them down on their front, that is where you will really start to see the size difference. These goggles are a lot deeper than the V2s, and that is because they have that display mounted on the top there. Comparing the N3 to the Goggles 3, you can see the size difference is even more dramatic, but it is worth me mentioning that these are completely different goggles at completely different price points. This is a box goggle. This is a typical OLED goggle with the lenses that we're used to seeing from the likes of Fat Shark and others. Now, further to what I discussed earlier on the antennas on these goggles, I've now actually done my full teardown. There will be a link to that in the description if you want to see a lot more about what's inside. I did a complete rip apart. It's a live stream, so please do consider checking it out if you want to see more. However, I'm now able to confirm a couple of additional things with regards to the antennas on these goggles. Now, these goggles are tri-band goggles. Whilst the O4 ear unit that's come in is going to only be 5 gigs, these goggles do support 2.4, 5.2 and 5.8 gig bands, just like the Goggles 3. As I mentioned earlier, these goggles have 4 antennas. You have your 2 external antennas up here. These are tri-band omnidirectional polarized antennas. These support 2.4, 5.2 and 5.8 gigs. With regards to their dB rating, DJI state 2 dB at 2.4 gigs, 1.5 dB at 5.2 and 2.5 dB at 5.8. Now, with regards to the internal antennas, there are 2 directional antennas mounted in the front of these goggles here. They are still linear polarized, but they are directional. They're not massively directional. They're not like you get from the likes of True RC having a 9 dBi front gain, but they are rated higher than the omnidirectional antennas up here. They are rated at 3 dB at 2.4 gigs, 3.5 dB at 5.2 and 4 dB at 5.8. DJI do actually show the radiation pattern for these in their FCC documentation. It's not particularly great, but these antennas are really actually quite interesting. They're 2 different parts. They're mounted on the plastic behind here. I'll put something up on the screen so you can see it. But then there's reflecting elements actually mounted on the main optical module as well, and I cover a lot more about that in the teardown, so if you want to know more, please do consider checking it out. With regards to the upgradability of these antennas, you are going to need to tear the goggles apart to replace them, but it is also worth me mentioning that the antenna connections on these goggles are not your standard UFLs. They are much smaller IPX connectors like we've seen on the likes of Wi-Fi adapters on PCs. So if you did want to modify these, you absolutely could. The antenna connections are down here, but you are going to need cables that have the right fitting. I don't know the exact name of that fitting at this moment in time, but it isn't a standard UFL. Now, just to make your life a little bit easier to show you what the antenna setup is, I've created this image. This gives you an overview of the antennas on the goggles. So we've got our 2 at the top, our 2 on either side, and the only other antenna that you do have in these goggles is the GFSK antenna for the RC control link, which is located down here in the nose. Now, it's very hard for me to show you what the image quality and the displays are like on these goggles, but I do have a video here of some FPV footage that I've previously recorded, and I'm showing you this through a recording of the lens on my Sony camera. Now, I have made some interesting observations, which I will talk about a lot more later on in the video. What I can say is the 1080p display on these goggles does look very good with regards to color and resolution. There are, though, issues with the optics, and I will explain this a lot more later on, but there are a few things such as reflections and pin cushioning that is definitely evident on the display, but I will go into this in a lot more detail when I talk about my findings towards the end of the video. Now, as a result of these goggles having that 60Hz display, you're obviously not going to get the same type of latency on this as you would get on the Goggles 3. DJI specs say when using the N3 with the Neo, you're going to have latency around 58 milliseconds, and when using the N3 on the Avata 2, the latency is around 31 milliseconds. As I've mentioned, even though that display is limited to 60Hz, you can still use the Avata 2 in the 100 frames a second modes. It's just that you won't get 100 frames a second through the display. I've also heard via the leaks that with these goggles and the new O4 ear unit, it will support the new race mode, which will allow latency on the Pro ear unit as low as 22 milliseconds, but that isn't absolutely confirmed at this moment in time. I'm going to have to wait for that release before we have the actual final numbers. Now, when it comes to remote controller compatibility, the situation is exactly the same on the Goggles N3 as it is the Goggles 3. It uses the new communication system with the remote controller communicates with the goggles, and then the goggles communicates with the drone. As a result of that, the only remotes that work with the Goggles N3 are the RC Motion 3 and the FPV Remote 3. You cannot use the FPV Remote version 2 or any of the earlier versions of the motion controller. Now, when it comes to the software, everything looks identical to what we've seen in the past on the Goggles 3, the Goggles 2 and the Enquiries. It's using this newer style menu system that we've had from DJI from their last few generations of goggles. At the top, we have status. This gives us all of the information and warnings. And then in the top corner, we have the option to switch between the different modes this goggle supports, showing you the different drones that it's compatible with. Album allows you to play back from your SD card. We've then got our transmission settings, which gives us the options for turning on and off broadcast mode, as well as enabling, disabling focus mode. And if you're in the correct region, the option for manual channel selection as well. Then under settings, we have our safety settings, control settings, camera settings, display settings, and our about menu. Again, all of this is exactly the same as we find on the likes of the Goggles 2, the Enquiries, and the Goggles 3. As a result of all of that software being the same, I can confirm that the FCC ham file hack works exactly the same on the Goggles N3 as all of the previous other goggles. You simply install it onto your SD card, place it in the goggles, and that will give you the full FCC mode, not only giving you full access to all of the manual channels, but the full FCC power levels as well. One nice feature that I do want to highlight with the Goggles N3 is the fact that it is fully compatible with the Goggles 3 and Spectator mode. Now, it doesn't matter which goggle is the master. You can set the Goggles 3 as the master or the N3 as the master, but you can spectate from the Neo and the Avata 2 to either of these goggles from the other. So for instance, you can have your Goggles 3 as your master goggle and spectate to the N3 on either of these drones without any problems at all. Unfortunately, there is no way to use these goggles or the Goggles 3 as a spectator in combination with the Goggles 2. Because these are O4, you can only spectate 2 goggles within the O4 system, and if you wanted to use the Avata 2, for instance, with the Goggles 2 and you wanted to spectate, you would have to either use another set of Goggles 2 or a Goggles Integra. What you can't do is spectate on the Avata 2 to Goggles 2 to either Goggles 3 or N3. Okay, so it's time for me to share with you my thoughts on the Goggles N3, and I'm going to split this up into a couple of sections. With regards to the hardware, the fit and feel, they are really comfortable goggles, no complaints whatsoever other than the weight. You can definitely feel the weight of these compared to the Goggles 3 and the earlier ones, even compared to the V2s, if I'm honest. There is no question that these are a big and bulky goggle. They are absolutely an adult goggle. I see no world where you will be putting these on young children. They just are too big for that. With regards to the controls and externally, no complaints at all. I prefer the joystick compared to the touchpad. The fit and feel on the face is really comfortable as well. I have basically no light leak around the tops. The only place I get a little bit is down the bottom here, but they are pretty good with regards to fitment, although I will say they do press on the nose because of their weight. One of my big complaints on the Goggles 2 was basically I couldn't breathe. The Goggles 3 fixed that because of that type of headband with the goggles hanging down, but because this is a goggle that is sitting on your face and it is pressing on your nose, I do find that it does put pressure, and I did lose my ability to breathe through my nose as I have on some of the earlier goggles. With regards to the head strap and the battery mechanism, it's all the same as the previous goggles. I've not really got any complaints there. I would have liked this battery cable to have been removable, and maybe then you could have put your own one on, but all DJI have done here with this is cut some cost. It's not really made users' life any easier. With regards to upgrades and modifications on these goggles for external antennas, unfortunately these are fixed, and I use the word fixed loosely because everything is removable if you try hard enough, but they are officially fixed antennas with no removable connections, but there will be connectors inside, and when I tear these down, we'll have a proper look at what the upgrade options are in the future. It's certainly not as easy to do as the likes of the Goggles 2 as an example. Now, when it comes to the real important stuff on this goggle, such as the image quality, the displays and the lenses, this is where things get a little bit more complicated. Now, I've spent a lot of time testing these, and the way I actually did this to allow me to get a lot more time on them than I would have normally done is I downloaded a bunch of my own previously recorded FPV videos, DJI drone videos, anything where I filmed. I put about 4.5 hours of footage on SD cards, and I sat through watching that footage back on these goggles, watching that footage back on the V2s, the Goggles 3 and the Goggles 2, and comparing them all. But I have also flown it in real world as well. I used the videos though just to allow me to get a lot more time on them than I usually would have. As a result of that, I've come to some interesting conclusions and noticed some things around these goggles with regards to the optics. The display itself is really good. I like the 1080p display. It's crisp, the colors are great, and actually it's shocking how much more resolution is in this display compared to what you had on the V2s especially. When jumping between the V2s and this, it is night and day the difference between the displays themselves. Where this gets more complex is the optics, because there are a number of things here that are different to the other goggles. For starters, there is an incredible amount of pin cushioning on the displays of these goggles as a result of the optics. You may not notice this at first when you look through them, but if you actually zoom out with the feature that makes the display smaller, you really start to see it. The display is very, very warped on these goggles compared to any of the previous goggles from DJI. It's the kind of thing that you might not see instantly, but once you have seen it, you can't easily unsee it. It isn't very distracting in normal use, but it is there and you will notice it once you get some time on the goggles. Now, when it comes to this pin cushioning, it's actually quite hard to show you on camera. Here, I'm recording the image from the Neo on the display, and we're at 100% scaling. Now, I have found you can see this pin cushioning a bit easier if you reduce the scaling. So for instance, if I go down into the menu on the goggles, if we then go down to the display options, and if we take the display scaling down to say 70%, back out of it, and if I just realign the camera so we can see things, in my view, looking through it with my eyes, the pin cushioning is much more noticeable. I don't think I can easily show it to you here on camera, but please take my word for it, it is definitely noticeable. The second issue is the lenses. And this is a bit more subjective because some people may have this and some people won't. I am getting some slight out of phasing with regards to the quality on the display. For me, I don't generally have any problems with any other sets of goggles, but I'm normally using goggles with IPD adjustment. I didn't though have any problems on the V1s or the V2s with regards to focus. These though, I am definitely getting areas of the display which are a little bit muddy because I cannot easily get it to be perfect for both of my eyes, even if I push the goggles in closer. I actually find if I move the goggles a bit further away from my head, things are a bit better, but I'm moving it a lot further away than you would be able to do with a foam mask. I'm putting like a centimetre between myself and the face mask. Overall, it's not that the optics are terrible, it's not that they're bad, but for me, I cannot get them as crystal clear as I can on the other goggles. I almost find it's like my eyes are having to auto-focus every time I look in a different place. Because the field of view is so large on these goggles, if I focus in on the center, it looks great. But then if I sort of look to the side to have a look at an OSD item, I find it that it's out of focus. And I actually notice my eyes sort of messing around to get it right. You may, though, not have this. This is the kind of thing that may affect some people, may not. I don't wear glasses. I generally have what I believe to be very good eyesight. I'm not aware of having any issues. I might actually go and have an eye test to understand, actually, to see if there is something going on. But it isn't something I've experienced on any of the other goggles. Now, when it comes to seeing that whole big 54-degree field of view display, it's okay. It's certainly big enough that you're not going to see everything at once. You are going to have to sort of look around the display to see things, but I do like a big field of view. It's not as big as the V2s, but it's much nicer than what we've got on the other goggles. Another thing to mention on the displays is reflections, and there is quite a lot of them in these goggles. You will see in the menu system at times parts of the image reflecting, and you will see certain parts of it appearing here and there. It is not in flight in my experience. It is only really when you're looking at static images, when you're looking here on the bench, but there is a lot more reflections in this goggle compared to some of the others, but that is to be expected as a result of it using a mirror setup. Now, when it comes to comparison compared to other goggles, this is a complicated thing because the only other goggle you can really compare it to is the Goggles 3, because that's the only other goggle that's compatible with the same drones. From a physical perspective, you can compare it to the likes of the V2s and the V1s, and in my opinion, these are hands down better than the V2 and V1s optically, as well as the quality of the displays. Even though I don't find the optics perfect, they are much better than the optics on the V2s. What they're not, though, is as good as the Goggles 3 for me. The Goggles 3 has been the best goggle I have used from DJI, but it's not that these are bad, but they're definitely not in the same league as the Goggles 3 with regards to overall image quality and the overall fit and feel. In the end, what we have here is a goggle that I actually think is really good value. It is DJI's cheapest goggle to date. It is an entry point into FPV with the likes of the Neo or the Avata 2, and hopefully, as we believe, they will be fully compatible with the DJI O4 E-units as well. And whilst they are not at the same level as the Goggles 3, it is incredible what you're getting here for the money. They are certainly not perfect. Reflections, pin cushioning are not the best optics, but for $230 from a DJI perspective, there is nothing that comes close. And again, you have the option of using them as a spectator goggle if you wanted to as well. So there really is a lot to like here. They're definitely not a premium goggle, but it is hard to complain in the end for what you're getting for the price. Now, if you're interested in getting a set, I will put a link to a couple of retailers in the UK that I use here. It's not affiliate links. It will just be a link to people who have supported the channel. So if you are interested in getting a set, please do consider checking them out. I want to also say a huge thank you to Grey Arrows Drone Club, who have sponsored this video. We would not have been able to buy these goggles without their support. Please do consider checking out the link to their website. As I've said already, you have their discussion forums, you have their insurance that is available as well, and Drone Scene, which will tell you places that you can fly in the UK. So again, a massive thank you from me to Grey Arrows. We would not have been able to do this without their support, so please do check them out. Now, if you have any questions on these goggles, please do let me know below. Any comments, anything you want to know that I haven't talked about, put it down there. We will obviously be talking about this a lot more when we get the O4E unit as well. So if you want to see that, please do make sure you are subscribed. I am also doing a teardown on these goggles. There will be a link to that below too. If it's not there, it means it hasn't actually happened yet. But when it is there, the link will be there. So check that one out as well. Finally, I just want to say, if you'd like to support us to allow us to keep making content like this in the future, please do consider checking out the links to my Patreon as well as Buy Me a Coffee. It is only through the support of my patrons I'm able to keep making content on this channel. And if you'd like to support us to allow us to make new videos in the future, please do check it out. I want to say a huge thank you to all of my patrons. We would not be able to keep doing this without your support. Anyway, that's it. Goggles N3. Not perfect, but for the money, very, very good. Stay safe. I will speak to you soon.